Hello everyone, and welcome to Famous Battles in Canadian History, where we cover the most famous battles in Canadian history. This week, we will be covering one of our most requested battles ever, the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Longtime listeners of this show know that I'm not much for formalities, so let's jump right in. Vimy Ridge was situated in the heart of France, alongside the small town of Arras. It was a huge hill, and at the top commanded an extensive view of the countryside around. After the Germans captured it, they set to work fortifying it, making it impregnable, putting in concrete trenches and bunkers, all to withstand an attack from the Allies. They put in machine gun posts with interesting, overlapping fields of fire, causing the most devastation. Also, further back, they set up artillery so that they could bombard the Allies from a distance and protect their own men. A little ways away lay the Canadian forces, all under the command of a Sir Julian Byng. Sir General Julian Byng knew that if he wanted to take Vimy Ridge, he would have to come up with a few of his own tactics and ideas, with the old ones being outdated and not useful. He and his other colleagues started the construction of an accurate model depicting the ridge in its entirety. From that model, they were able to map out a life-size version of the ridge for the Canadian troops to practice on. In a matter of weeks, the Canadian troops knew that ridge as well as the Germans themselves. The general also employed aerial reconnaissance to get detailed maps of the ridge to plan out where best to fire his artillery pieces on the day of the attack. In time for the attack, the general had perfected a new strategy that he called the creeping barrage. The creeping barrage was where a line of shells from several different artillery cannons were fired on the German lines. Then, they would begin a steady advance across no man's land behind the wall of shells. The wall of shells would keep the Germans pinned down in their entrenchments, allowing the Canadian troops to move up without being under constant heavy fire from their machine guns. With the ridge memorized and the new tactic perfected, the general knew that he had only one thing left to do. He had to inform every last soldier of his objectives. Now, this in of itself does not seem like a very noteworthy thing. Informing a soldier of his objectives, isn't that common practice? But no, back in the time of World War I, only officers and high-ranking members of the military had any idea what they were doing or where they were going. This caused a huge problem when soldiers in the battle, as most soldiers do, get killed, and officers, when they get killed, they die with their information. Soldiers and platoons were left helpless, not knowing what to do. With no information, they wandered aimlessly and were soon cut off from the rest of the platoon. Now that common soldiers knew where they were going, it greatly increased the effectiveness of the army, in that if the captain or leader of the platoon died, the second in command could take over and know where they were going. Finally, the day came, the day that the general had been planning for. April 12th, 1917, the day of the attack. At 5:30, the artillery pieces opened up on the ridge, showering shells down onto the Germans, causing them to go down into their dugouts. Seeing this, the shell line moved forward, and the Canadian troops after it. They were able to march up all the way to the trenches of the opposing enemy. They hopped in, and with their bayonets and grenades, quickly cleared the Germans out, then moved up. Trench by trench they took, and the Germans fell before them. The Canadians took heavy casualties, but the Germans' casualties were even heavier. By the end of the attack, there was over 10,602 men dead or wounded. It was a terrible price for the ridge, but the Canadians had done it. They had taken the ridge. And now it's time for our soldier segment. For the soldier segment this week, I have two different soldiers that we're going to listen to. The first, a letter from Private A. Fowle of the Company of 9th Reserve, and Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, 4th Canadian Infantry Brigade. I'm going to start off with Private Fowle. On Sunday the 8th, we are withdrawn to the supports. His front line was swept from end to end, and we actually stood on top, watching the whole show. Dugout timbers and Fritzies were going 200 feet into the air. At nightfall, 50 of us went over and bombed them into their dugouts, grabbed a few prisoners, and bombed the dugouts. And judging from their squeals and confusion downstairs, we made them suffer severely. We had to hurry back as his guns were giving us a bit of hell. We had a few casualties, but got back over no man's land, which was a mass of mud and water and wire and stakes. There was the most beautiful display of fireworks for an hour. We killed many with bayonet and bomb. We worked hard all night and lost many men. Our trenches were a sea of mud and slime and bodies of our comrades killed by the terrible weight of the naval shells, which they showered upon us from their 8-inch guns. We captured these guns the same day and turned them on the enemy. Private Fall would survive the battle, becoming a wounded in a trench raid, and was added to the 7,004 wounded. 3,595 men were killed at Vimy Ridge, staggering losses for the Canadians. And now I'm going to move on to Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig. Out of the mist, wrote the diarist for the 2nd Canadian Mounted Rifles, exploded a curtain of fire from 983 guns and mortars. At 5:30 a.m. on Easter Monday, April 9th, 1917, attacking battalions from the 4 Canadian divisions crept forward behind the wall of flame and smoke, up the gentle slope leading to the covered Vimy Ridge. Shells burst along a 6.4-kilometer front as far as the eye could see. The first artillery barrage lifted, and the infantry pushed forward through the sections of uncut barbed wire, over ground churned up beyond recognition. Close on their heels swept the stretcher bearers, searching for the wounded. The Canadians, with guns that often jammed with mud, faced the determined German soldiers firing machine guns, rifles, and revolvers at point-blank range. It was the first time all 4 Canadian divisions had fought together. Intense training, thorough planning, and coordination, superior intelligence gathering, and the determination carried Bing's boys forward at times through the driving sleet to take the ridge. When the battle was over, it was April 12th, and there were 10,602 casualties. Sadly, we have come to the end of this podcast. Thank you for listening, and it really means a lot that people like what they're hearing. I will try to keep on turning out quality material. Just a few people I would like to thank for the creation of this podcast. Number 1, I would like to thank my long-standing editor, Suzanne Raymond, for suffering through the first drafts of this script. And I would also like to thank the inspiration for this podcast, Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, you are one of the best teachers in the whole world, and I really thank you for giving me the inspiration to start this podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Famous Battles in Canadian History, and, as always, I'm your host, Joshua Raymond, saying, history isn't just a bunch of dead dudes and dates. It's a story. Thanks a lot, guys.